evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the panel discussion on new media and Indian elections 2019, presented by the Indian Express and OP Jindal Global University. I'm Pooja Pillai and I'm your presenter this evening. I work with the Indian Express, by the way. In less than 2 weeks, the great event of democracy, that is the Indian general elections, will begin. And in as much as any one election is more important than any other election, this is going to be a pretty important one for us in the history of Indian democracy. And one major reason why this is so is, and perhaps also why it is going to be an historic election, is because, as we already know, new media is going to play a major role here. We've already seen what happens when new media becomes a big factor in deciding election results. 3 years ago, against pretty much every mainstream expectation, Donald Trump was elected the President of the United States of America. And as we've come to realize, social media platforms such as Facebook especially had a big role to play in this. The 3 years between that historic election and the one that is coming up is a long enough time to do a lot of soul searching, and that is precisely what this panel is here for. We're here to understand what lessons to draw from the elections that gave the world a President Trump. And when it comes to elections, how do we avoid the worst that new media represents, while also leveraging its enormous capacity for information dissemination and for enabling conversations that wouldn't otherwise be allowed to exist? Our eminent panel will discuss these questions and more in greater detail and nuance. Moderating this discussion is Tom Goldstein, founding dean, Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. Welcome, Tom. And may I invite you to please introduce the panelists?
Thank you so much, Pooja. And before I introduce the panel, let me acknowledge two Rajas. Raj Kumar, the Vice Chancellor of Jindal Global University, and in absentia, Raj Kumar, who's, I'm told, in traffic, but when he gets here, we will give him a proper hello. And I'm delighted that we're collaborating on this subject, and I'm glad so many people are here on a Friday night. And this discussion that we're going to have for an hour or so can go any number of ways, and it's my job to keep it focused and to be unobtrusive. And let me just tell you how we're going to do it, or the way I'd like to do it, and you can vote me down, I suppose, by the time you start talking. I'm going to introduce the panelists, then I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then each panelist will have, say, 5 minutes for opening remarks. And then the next third of the evening will be a back and forth amongst the panelists. And then for the last segment, we're going to open it up to the audience, which I'm going to try to get to as soon as possible. Now I'm going to try to focus on two big themes, which Pooja already alluded to. The burgeoning role of social media and what that means, and the issue of disinformation. And in part, sort of the global lead of this is how to, if we were to retitle it, how will this election be different from earlier elections? But to use the earlier elections to guide us. Okay, so let me introduce the panelists. Ravish Tiwari. Let me go ahead. Ravish Tiwari, National Affairs Editor of the Indian Express. Nandu Rajan, Editor of New Media at the Indian Express. Pamposh Reina, a journalist and the lead on UC Berkeley's Project on Disinformation in the run-up to the Indian election. She tells me that the project does not have a formal name, but she calls it India in Focus. And then finally, my old colleague, Jeremy Rue, a former student, who's Assistant Dean for Academics at the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, and a multimedia whiz who's spent the last week on the Jindal campus. And to my left is my sidekick, Ashima Sharma, who's going to help me out. And if I, quite frankly, sometimes I don't understand fully Hindi or whatever other dialect, so she's going to help me not make a fool of myself. So let me just have brief remarks. Conveniently, in a column in the Express earlier this week, an academic, Rasmus Kleis Nielsen, wrote a column. He's the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. And he wrote, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and a few other major politicians have built significant social media following, built a significant social media following that helped them circumvent news media and set the agenda. But news media still remain crucial for how most people navigate politics. And of course, after I wrote this, Modi gave an interview. But that's an exception. So it's one of the subtexts, which I hope we can get to, is how you cover a candidate who does not wish to engage with you. In this op-ed column, Nielsen also notes how Google and Facebook have great power. The 2019 elections, he said, will be a decisive test of whether they're ready for it or not. Again, another issue we might talk about. And then quickly, other background that I found pertinent in doing my research for the panel tonight. There is a Pew poll which shows that 250 million Indians have gone online since the last general election, which is an astonishing number. And what are the consequences of that, I hope we can talk about. And there are going to be 900 million people expected to vote in this next election. So maybe I'll splice some more facts as we go along, but let me get to the panel first. And by luck of the draw, Pampos, you're first.
Thank you, Doc.
Okay.
So, I know you wanted me to talk about, why disinformation is a problem. Yeah, is this clear now? Yeah. So Tom wanted me to talk about, disinformation as a problem. So I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about when we started collectively thinking about it as a problem. And I'd like to go back to, 2018 specifically. And in India, we focused our attention to the larger problem of disinformation as well as misinformation after rumors that spread primarily through social media led to mob lynching in various parts of our country. And like I said, majority of these rumors, were reported in 2018, and they were about child kidnappers being on the news. And that was a time, I think a lot of us became cognizant of the fact that these rumors were either being spread through the social media or through messaging apps. And most of these reported incidents occurred in smaller towns and villages in India. Irate mobs unleashed their fury on unsuspecting men, women, and transgender people after believing in unsubstantiated reports. I beg your pardon. Profiles of the victims have ranged from a software engineer who lost his life for distributing chocolates among school children in a village in the southern Indian state of Karnataka, to an encounter, to an announcer slate for trying to dispel child kidnap rumors on the borders of the government of Tripura, which is a state in India's northeast. And one could argue that rumors aren't new to India. For instance, in 2017, bizarre accounts of witches snipping off women's hair surfaced out of nowhere. And not too long before that, when a teenage boy went missing on the outskirts of Delhi, unsubstantiated reports emerged that visiting African nationals had eaten him up, which led to deadly violence against them. Of course, there have been several cases over the last few years of men being brutalized over rumors of storing beef or smuggling cattle. Usually, once a rumor starts, it is known to take a life of its own, especially especially through social media, which has a wider and faster reach, but eventually it does die down. Except for cases where the motivation behind keeping rumors alive is to stoke negative sentiments among people or against members of a certain religion, caste, gender, or people belonging to certain political or ideological groupings. The problem is that right now no one has control over what is being shared on these social media platforms and messaging groups. We don't have a sense of why certain rumors get more attention than others. Going back to the example of the child kidnap rumors, in that case, no one could point out why these rumors became viral or who was behind them. But we are talking of, 35-odd people being killed because of these rumors, which may not seem big if you're looking at the population of this country, but the number is big enough for us to sort of stand up and start thinking collectively about what problems the social media throws up and what can be done to address some of those issues. And right now, no one seems to have those answers. So when I was talking to a lot of people about the child kidnap rumors, and there were reports from various parts of the country, so one of the explanations that was surprisingly given by police officers, some of them were investigating these cases. So they said that there was a high incidence of such violence in areas where child kidnap rumor were I beg your pardon, in areas where the number of missing children was high. And in areas with a large concentration of poor and illiterate population. And in those areas where parents had lost contact with their children after they left home in search of a livelihood, hoping to break away from a life of poverty. And typically these were children who were lured away by someone who visited them after working in the city, demonstrating a visibly better lifestyle through their clothes and accessories. And a lot of people get lured because of the lifestyle that is demonstrated by some others who go to the city to work there. And parents often want to send their children to work in the cities and they never return. So when these rumors were afloat in parts of the country where the numbers and statistics of missing children was high, the explanation that a lot of people gave was that there was an underlying fear of among people there of losing their children. Hence, they reacted to these rumors very violently. And I'd like to talk about a recent example of misinformation with which a lot of us would be familiar about. And this is the Pulwama attack and what exactly happened on social media after that. I don't know, a lot of people sitting in the room probably are aware that there was a lot of misinformation about the attacker, and surprisingly, even some of the mainstream outlets, and I'm not going to name those outlets, fell prey to that. And Boom Live, which is a very well-respected fact-checking website, it carried reports about those publications and suggesting that it was surprising that nobody could trace where those reports came from. So the larger point here is that when we are talking about misinformation, even journalists tend to fall prey to that because we often don't understand that what the source of particular information could be, but because it's breaking news, we tend to look into that and we tend to feel that it's perhaps important to give that piece of information, and in the process, somewhere, we just accentuate the problem unknowingly. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And let me use the moderator's prerogative. You mentioned fact-checking, which would seem to be an obvious concept, but it's not. And maybe others can jump in before you have your 5 minutes, or you can and let me give you just a 30-second lesson in what I understand as fact-checking. There were several magazines in the United States, primarily the New Yorker, second Reader's Digest, Playboy, and the National Enquirer, the tabloid, who employed fact-checking departments, which meant that they would re-report the story. Newspapers are not fact-checked. in that sense of the word, because there's no time, they're deadlines. So we talk about fact, I mean, that things are edited, they don't purposely put out false information. But fact-checking became something of a rage, and people use it, which is a term of art, in an imprecise way. And there's been an explosion of fact-checking. Some of it's good, some of it's less good. But let me now turn to Jeremy, backing up in time a little chronologically.
Yeah, so in the US, obviously we've had this, our taste of the results of disinformation in our 2016 election, where we essentially saw social media not only used effectively, it was essentially weaponized by a state actor to influence the outcome of the campaign. Whether or not how much influence it really had on the results of the election is something open to debate. And many of the students I was talking to at Jindal were asking a lot about the current situation with the Mueller report and whether Trump had any coordination, and those are questions that are still being figured out. But the fact that a state actor, Russia, played a role in certainly attempting to sway the election and launch an influence campaign is demonstrably true, and it's something that has been widely reported. And I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of Americans who realized. I mean, we all saw it in 2016. We noticed it. We didn't really fully understand its proliferation and its effect. And I think it's now entered the public consciousness. These terms of disinformation, misinformation, fake news are now part of our vocabulary. And I think that consciousness has really played a role in the more recent election we just had last year, the midterm election, because now people are more aware of the issue. And one of the as Tom was pointing out, one of the ways that a lot of media organizations are combating it is through fact-checking. You've seen a lot of news websites and other startups whose sole purpose is to fact-check the news and trying to sort of fight fire with fire, using the tools of social media to spread messages to say, hey, there's a rumor going around and it's incorrect.
When I left the United States a couple of years ago, I mean, I thought social media was this force for good.
Yeah.
And has it lost that?
It's interesting. People for years criticized the mainstream media as being gatekeepers of information and free thought, and the internet was supposed to democratize free thought among the masses. And it's an interesting period where I think the professional media and its role to help analyze information and help interpret it still is an important part of the media ecosystem. But it's interesting how we're seeing the double-edged sword of the internet and social media.
Okay. Before I go, thank you. Before I get to Nandu, let me acknowledge the second Raj has arrived. Thanks so much for coming. You can applaud. Okay. Nandu, beforehand we were going back and forth, and you wrote to me, if 2014 were India's first social media election, then 2019 will be its first dark social election. What does that mean?
So I think the concept of dark social is something which is very obvious in India, and people don't realize that it's there. So in the case of 2014 and the run-up to the 2014 elections, you saw a lot of Indians actually got to Twitter, primarily Twitter, and to Facebook because they wanted to follow what the political leaders were saying, right? So actually the fact that Modi was there was a big driver for Twitter itself. It grew exponentially in almost a year running up to the elections. So 2019 is very different. So as far as Twitter and Facebook go, they have both hit saturation points in India. They haven't grown literally for the past year or 2 years. But there are a lot of people who, so about 400 million new, let's say 300 million new mobile users have been added, online users have been added in India in the past 2-3 years. And that is not really reflected in the numbers of Facebook and Twitter. They have actually added to something called WhatsApp. And WhatsApp is something where even WhatsApp doesn't know what's happening inside. WhatsApp was primarily created as a platform where within an office I would use it to pitch about my boss with a colleague. And the encryption was for that. That encryption is now at scale. It has almost 1 billion users. The world has not seen encryption on scale. Right? Encryption has always been a small, it's always been a limited group kind of product. But to see encryption scale, then you know that there's a completely different beast which you cannot control. So even WhatsApp doesn't know what's happening within WhatsApp. And that is not the only platform. There are much smaller platforms like Telegram, which doesn't have the scale of WhatsApp, but has or covers conversations which could be very important. And the other thing I would like to set the context here is that when we say new media in India, we are talking mobile. Every new user that's coming to online in India is coming on mobile. Desktop/broadband growth has been 0 for the past 2-3 years. Everybody is coming on mobile. There is another big difference when you compare it to the US, is that in India, most of the users are discovering news via search or social. And these two users have very different behavior from a direct user. A direct user is somebody who would go directly to an nyt.com or an interexpress.com for their daily consumption of news. In India, they are going via search, which means, let's say I'm searching for Narendra Modi interview today. I'll see 3 stories that are played up and a list of other stories. Only the 3 stories get the clicks, the others don't. But there I don't have any loyalty to which brand is giving me the news. So there it could be a small guy running a blog to a big Times of India. But then there is no loyalty, I'm not even looking at the masthead, I'm just consuming the news. I'm just consuming the news and getting out. The other big difference in India is WhatsApp and how people consume news on WhatsApp. For a lot of Indians who have come to mobile or to the internet for the first time, WhatsApp is not a messaging platform. Maybe they're not even literate enough to have a conversation on WhatsApp. It is a consumption platform for them. And what do they consume? They don't read much. They consume video. And video is where India's big fake news problem lies. Because a video shot in Colombia, because the color of the people's skin in both parts of the world can be passed off as a video pertaining to Indians. And a lot of that is happening. Because video can go without context, and 90% of the times on WhatsApp, video is without context. And without context of location, time, or anything else. And a lot of people just consume that news without understanding how and where it was created.
Thank you. Before we go on, I'm going to take to Ravi. Excuse me, I'm going to try to have a different point. A long time ago, I was sort of in my misplaced career objectives, unplanned career. I was the press secretary to the mayor of New York named Ed Koch, which is an oxymoron because he didn't really need a press secretary. He never stopped talking. And the big challenge was, he would go to the men's room and reporters would follow him, except female reporters couldn't follow him and they complained. So one of my things that I edict was, when you go to the bathroom, you go by yourself. Things like that. He was mayor actually when Trump began to become a figure in New York City, and I believe that Trump learned a lot from him. Amongst the things that Koch did, he was totally comfortable in front of a camera. You would see, he would sit and talk to a camera as if it was not a machine. He would go out on the streets of New York in this uninhibited fashion and yell, "How am I doing?" which became his slogan. And even when he didn't yell at people, would tell him. And he just loved it. And as I said, he smothered reporters. As press secretary, I was press secretary for 2 years, and I can think of one occasion when when the sort of notoriously hard-bitten New York reporters ever asked a hard question or asked to gather information. He just controlled the media. And I thought it was terrible. But it was good for him. And then he decided to run for higher office, and that was his mistake. But what I see is an analogy with what Trump is doing with Twitter. He gets up earlier in the morning than most reporters and controls the news consumption of the day by saying something either totally outrageous or mildly outrageous on Twitter, and that steers the conversation for hours to come. So, Ravish, what is the role? Well, what challenges does the legacy media have in this new world? And secondarily, how do we communicate without a curator, without a gatekeeper that Jeremy referred to?
As a reporter in the field, people have opinion about social media. I'm still watching how it's growing up in India. The numbers are staggering. Looking at the mobile internet that Nandu talked about, number of the kind of demography that we are in. But a couple of things which is still evolving is how it is reshaping, restructuring India's political culture. So it's a new kind of political organization is coming into being. So earlier, a political worker, when we talk to a political leader, would tell you how he began from a humble beginning. He used to ride on a bicycle for canvassing and meeting people on a daily basis and sitting in street corner meetings. But that political worker has got a new element. So social media has created a new kind of political worker. So who doesn't need to be there in the field. He doesn't need to take a bicycle and roam around in the streets in the remote corners of India. All he needs to sit in New York and campaign for Aam Aadmi Party as they did in 2013 and 2015, or they campaigned for Narendra Modi from sitting in San Francisco and campaigning in 2014. So these people are campaigning sitting abroad. So a new kind of political worker has come up. So it has not replaced those political workers, but a new kind of political worker has come into place. Likewise, even within the political parties, a restructuring has begun, or a new kind of political culture is building up. So for a long, we had one press room in the political party, and there will be one person who will come on a daily basis as a spokesperson. But now, when the broadcast media became all pervasive, the role widened a bit to create number of panelists that go on TV panels every evening. But now, you can localize your mobile internet content so much that now they have different departments altogether. They have departments, IT cells at national level, the state level, district levels. They are coordinators for that. So a new kind of political culture is evolving. So even that those cells are not just a political worker. They can be anybody. They have a full-fledged team of multimedia creators. So they are creating videos, they are creating graphic, they are creating text content. So a new kind of political organization is changing. Even the political movement, earlier the only way we know, everybody knows Occupy Wall Street. In India it used to be sit-ins, rallies. Those were the quintessential political cultures. But now you have new movement which can be diffused from remotely, people can gather. The most latest example was the Me Too movement. There was no a rally on Jantar Mantar in India, but it cost a minister his job. So a new kind of political movement is being built around these social media platforms. So entire political culture is changing, and I am still, as a practitioner journalist, I'm still observing how this medium is going to reshape our political culture. I mean, some scholars have called it post-material political culture. So this is a new kind of political culture is evolving. Coming to your point, how participants in this post-material political culture are operating is one issue that you asked without a curator. So the content, there was in a legacy media, there was an editor, there was people, professional journalists who will go and verify content, verify claims, counter claims. They will give you the second version of the story also, the second side of the claim also. That was a job which a professional media, legacy media did. But now there is no cost to publish it. So every vested interest is a publisher. So a political party doesn't need an editor. They themselves publish a blog, tweet it, put it on their Facebook, put it on their Instagram, and it's going to probably more number of consumers, readers, than probably a whole legacy media could hope to reach. So that is one thing. The problem is that it just is that the one claim is that it democratizes, that I don't need a filter, I want my content to go to my audience unvarnished. But the issue is that now the publisher are even the vested interests. The vested interests are publishers. So that is one challenge that's coming. How we are dealing, we are still trying to gauge how this is operating, because other sides are also equally powerful doing that. So those are the issues.
So are you saying that journalism has a diminished role? The legacy, traditional journalism?
No. So the one issue that, like Nandu pointed out, that people are in India at least, they're consuming a lot of news and information with the help of search and social media. But the issue is that the challenge for us is, can we create a credibility enough? So because you know that, so even the rival side can publish a counter theory and reach directly to the audience. So if I'm saying this is red, your rival political party can say that no, this is black. And it's also reaching the same audience. So whom are you going to trust? So this is where we as a legacy media can we create a trust, credibility, and that is the currency that's going to be operated in this world. So then a confused audience, a consumer will have to come to a place where there is a credibility. So this is where we have to keep building on that credibility to invite eyeballs.
Okay. I would like to sort of step aside and have you go at it amongst the four of you for a while.
You know, this idea of disintermediation, I think, is something we talked a lot about in the early days of the internet, the fact that celebrities, politicians can go direct to consumers. But the new thing that emerged was that so many of these direct messages, and as Tom pointed out, sparked so much analysis and so much dialogue. I still feel that it's less curation. It's not a filter, but the fact that Trump, when he tweets in the morning, launches a narrative that everybody talks about it, fact checks it, discusses it, and when a celebrity posts something controversial, it becomes a news item. The news still plays a critical role in terms of interpreting and that, through analysis of what's going on in the media ecosystem. But it's in parallel in some ways. But I think you raise a really good point about credibility, because one of the things about social media is it really relies on a psychological effect, a marketing theory, the word of mouth marketing. The idea that you're much more likely to buy something if it's recommended by a friend than you are seeing it in an advertisement. And I think social media has that effect, that people find things more credible when people tell them about something. Hey, I heard this thing is happening. I heard this rumor, and because of that personalization, because it's so close, it puts the onus on journalists to really establish themselves as a very credible source to counter that information. And on encryption, I come from a very different perspective. It's idealistic, the idea of free speech and in the marketplace of ideas, the truth will prevail. But it's this it really in practice. I mean, it really challenges this notion. Don't suppress it, counter it. And I think we train our student journalists at Berkeley to really help understand the new media forms, and so that they can put news on Instagram, on WhatsApp, on Facebook, and counter the narratives through these new modes of communication, and learn how to make effective messaging and how a media form can spread very quickly in both directions, both misinformation and fact-checked information.
So, if I can just come in on again talking about platforms. And you have a lot of new platforms, like you have a lot of students here, and you notice that a lot of them might not be using the popular platforms. And you have, so I met a lot of students across different places over a period of time, and they were all talking about, a certain thing, and it's about voting nota. It means that I'm not in favor of any candidate that's being put up. So a lot of kids are talking in the same thing and across multiple cities. So there are these common threads that are going around, which is not really surfaced. You haven't seen it because they are on completely different platforms from where the masses are. So a lot of these interesting conversations happening. And also on credibility, I can tell you how tough it is to be on the forefront of that, especially doing online, where we are in the now business, not in the today business like the newspaper. So everything has to be done now or yesterday. So it's very tough being there, but at least in our newsroom, we keep on striving to ensure that we are still going to be a bit late, so that we can still verify everything. And we are in a world where we can't trust even news agencies anymore.
Can you talk a little bit about the new audience and what the new audience is versus 2014?
Yeah, so I can start by asking you how many of you know how many of you have heard about something called TikTok? Right, yes, everybody's heard about it. How many of you are there on TikTok? Right? So there's hardly anybody there on TikTok. If I ask the same question in a tier 3 city in India, everybody will be on TikTok. So that's this big divide we have from an audience perspective. So we are no longer talking to one India. There are multiple Indias out there. So if you go to Tamil Nadu doesn't like Facebook for some strange reason. Tamil Nadu likes Twitter. And you have a reason for it. All the stars in Tamil actually ended up on Twitter first before they went on Facebook. So Tamil Nadu is heavily skewed towards Twitter. And if you go to Kerala, for instance, which is just around the corner, it's all Facebook. And absolutely nothing happening on Twitter. So the Chief Minister of Kerala, who actually tweets a link to his Facebook post. So completely different audiences. So you cannot have this one lecture mode messaging anymore. So as Ravi said, which is why the parties have realized that you have to be hyper local in how you will tackle this messaging, and the messaging is very different, right? You can't talk about the same issues in all states. So it's also because the audiences are so different and they change every 15-20 kilometers.
I'd just like to add to something that you were mentioning earlier. You were talking about Telegram, and in India, a lot of our attention has been focused on WhatsApp, and we're not looking at some of these other messaging platforms and the kind of disinformation and misinformation that is being spread through these platforms. Because Telegram, for instance, you do have the end-to-end encryption, but you also have open channels that are open for anybody to join. So if we actually join some of the channels and some of the groups which are aligned to particular ideologies. It is shocking to see the kind of media that's exchanged and the kind of photos which probably have no contextual evidence to a particular event, but they'll be associated to something random happening somewhere else in the country. And I'll just give you a small example of something that I came across on Telegram. And this was around the time that there was a lot of talk about the verdict on Ayodhya coming out. And so there was this one image of saffron-clad people, which was, with their foreheads smeared in tika, and they were holding these swords in their hands. So there was a classic image that was going around, and obviously there was a message that was being sent across. And when we use some of the open source investigation tools to investigate where that image came from, it was actually nowhere close to Ayodhya. We traced that image to some particular event that happened in India several years ago. But again, the impact was such that the conversations around that image were alluding to certain incidents which never took place. So for consumers of that media, I mean, how many of them would go back and do something like a reverse image search to actually check if that was true or not? So I think my broader point is that while we talk about some of these bigger messaging platforms and apps, we also need to focus our attention on some of the apps like Telegram, which don't have such a huge penetration in India at the moment. But then, if you look at the potential of them being used for spreading misinformation, it's huge.
If I can just add a point here, is that Instagram is becoming a huge messaging platform now. YouTube is actually very popular in India. YouTube has messaging now, and people are not really looking at what message. So and there, if you're seeing a video, you are immediately discussing that video with 100 people, who are already in that group. So a lot of new messaging platforms itself have come up, and they all cater to different audiences and different types of conversations.
One of the challenges that we're experiencing in U.S. media, and I'm not sure how much it's been pervasive in Indian media, is sort of this polarization. Our society in the U.S. is very polarized, and with so many options, for media choices, people tend to look for affirmation. They try to read news that they agree with, and these platforms like Facebook, which is very popular in the U.S., have algorithms that are designed to essentially facilitate that, and because Facebook's algorithm wants to show you content that you enjoy, that you like, that you want to see. And so we start to see this emergence of these echo chambers and people who are just constantly consuming news information that you wouldn't want to see something in your feeds that you would find that you would disagree with, that you would find oppositional in some way. We want to be reaffirmed in the things that we believe. And that's a really tough challenge. And I've seen how that incentive structure, because the media is built a lot on advertising, it's pushed a lot of what we normally think is very impartial or centered publications, pushed them further to the right and pushed them further to the left. I mean, even some very respectable publications now, I think, play to their audience far more, because it's just a very implicit kind of incentive structure to get either clicks or to just get traction, just to get articles and feel like and you see it on both sides, and that's a real challenge that I think I'm not sure how we get out of that moving forward.
So polarization is something, in fact, if you start discussing on this issue, whether this is the social media is democratizing or polarizing, itself probably will be polarized here on this if you end up doing it. So polarizing is nothing but it's just a difference of opinion. The issue is that in earlier remark you mentioned, don't suppress it, counter it.
Yeah.
The issue is that, is it, the one thing I'm still trying to figure out, is it those people, those who are crying to that it's polarizing, is it most of the time would you find, like in India, we find the liberals are crying polarization. In US, it's Democrats who are crying polarization. So is it that the loser is trying to say that? I'm just trying to observe as an observer, is it that the loser who has not been, who was late to catch it is crying that it's polarizing? So I'm still trying to observe. So the trick is that you were late on the bandwagon. Here, the winner was very early on social media. So that is something which everybody seems to have formed an opinion. As journalists, I'm still trying to see, because it's a medium which is still trying to find its anchor, its feet in Indian market. And I'm trying to observe whether, because I have seen it also has a very huge democratizing effect. I don't think many of the Me Too allegations in India would have got published if the authors had come and told it to newsrooms. It's that Dalit protests last year happened. They organized, because the bottom rung of the section of the society, they organized at the national level, and a spontaneous protest on 2nd April last year. It happened because of this. So a marginalized community. Yesterday, one of the rights of food activists was arrested in Jharkhand. By seconds, we were getting information. It was flashed. There was public pressure on it. So it also has a democratizing effect. The issue is that most of the time, if you look at, if I'm trying to look below the surface, who is crying polarization? Is there a pattern? I'm not sure.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to the audience in a minute. But before I do that, I'm going to call on a specific person, Lakshmi Sarah. This is all produced, who's also from Berkeley, and we also spent the past week at Jindal. And Lakshmi is also a former student, but she does things that I have no clue about. You know, in the world, would you like to talk about that and the future from your perspective?
I think I'll just focus on my question.
Okay.
So when considering, in the U.S. elections, obviously there were things that should have been done, and there was very clear, like, targeted misinformation and disinformation. And so my question is two parts. So what do you think could be learned from that targeted disinformation and misinformation? And then how might that be combated and prevented specifically in the Indian context when we're thinking about dark social and private messaging?
You know, I don't think people really understand how many fake news websites, like real, like actual, like news websites, these that purported to be news, but were completely fictitious, had popped up, and I think a lot of the American public had probably a lot of people who are in the affluent areas didn't really see and know exactly how pervasive it was, because you only see the things you see in your feed, and if you're educated and you read, you know, newspapers, and you're just, you know, you picked your channels. In U.S. media, there was a whole swath of a number of publications that were just popping up left and right, and a lot of people just sharing information, and that was just completely fabricated, and just and almost had the illusion of being looking official with fancy graphics, and so I think one of the first things is that has sort of changed completely. I mean, the platforms have played a role in helping to demote those kinds of websites. There's a lot of initiatives that have been started up. There's this thing called the Trust Project of Mark Collison in Santa Clara, which is working with Facebook and Google to put these things called trust indicators on articles to give a sense of credibility, and they're going to promote.
Is that like a good housekeeping seal?
Yeah, it's a little kind of a good housekeeping. It's a seal, and in order you have to apply for it, and it's not based on any kind of political ideology. You just basically have to have a certain level of transparency, a corrections policy. There's a number of criteria in order to get one of these trust indicator seals, and the platforms are going to work with the publications in order to ensure that that it's visible in some way, so that users have some sense of credibility that this is coming from an official professional news organization that's dedicated to doing news. And so there's other various entities that are trying to build technological solutions to it. I'd love to hear.
Yeah. I guess, as Jeremy said, all the platforms have cleaned up. You've seen Twitter has cleaned up. Facebook, only Bollywood and cats and dogs work again, right? So if you put a political story, it's no longer red. We can see the analytics, and so it's cleaned up to an extent that if it thinks anything, and it's actually taking a section. It's not even looking at a specific story. It's saying if it's a political story, we are going to downplay it. So you will see more of tech and Bollywood and good housekeeping on your timeline instead of politics now. And it's been happening for a few months now. And the same with Google. Google is doing it in a different way. But anything it does could have an impact on the elections, could change how public opinion is. All of that is being played up. Is being played down because of what's happened in the US. But on the other hand, so what can we do, right? So if this mobile phone has made all of us a journalist, I think right now all of us also need to be a bit, also need to start playing, all of us need to be editors too. So this is the new thing that we have to do, and we have to do it as a disciplined, habit-creating kind of thing. So the thing is, we have to start gaming the algorithms. The algorithms have gamed us for quite some time. So you know that you are subscribing only to a certain political view, so it's fine. But also read the other side, so that the algorithm doesn't start giving you only one side, the one side you like, and you end up creating your own echo chamber. So ensure that you read the other side as a rule, so that the algorithm doesn't understand that you are one side. So this is something that it's difficult, I know, but maybe this is something we will all have to start practicing, because the algorithm is not your friend. So it is better.
About that, you have to get credibility, boss. Credibility of the editor is must.
No, I'm saying everybody becomes the editor.
Yeah, everybody. But
Yeah.
see, it is media who's spreading a lot of things. Okay.
So the stories from the media will not come to you.
Yeah.
The algorithm is yours.
Before that, you have to get credibility. What Nandu says is credibility.
Yeah.
Okay? Problem here is that whatever paid channel, whatever you want to say, we are creating it because there is no credibility of the news media. Okay? And see, like internet format, and it's unfair to compare US and India.
We can't compare. That's what I'm saying. We can't compare at all.
And you hit the name about WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Okay? And you also summed it up. Modi has taken a lead, boss. Okay? It's the social media. Again, I'm not Modi's supporter. But what we are doing is, by all this news, we are polarizing the society, and India is much more polarized now. Okay? And we are all responsible for it. And so media should be doing something. All of us are getting very correct solutions to this. Agreed. But please, my opinion or my recommendation is, it will take some time, because our credibility as bureaucrats or as human beings is very low to the masses. Okay, so please, very good, very informative, but we're all looking at what is going on, but what is the solution? Agreed? So solution, that's what I need to hear your views. Thank you.
So I would like to make a small comment to what you just said. And we often end up blaming the platforms for everything that's going wrong. But as consumers of information, I think the onus is also on us, because we randomly end up forwarding things. And that's a classic case with WhatsApp. I mean, those of us sitting in the room, how many of you are part of, WhatsApp groups? I'm sure there's a group for family, there's a group for, your colleagues, and there'll be several other groups. And day in and day out is information that's being circulated there. But how many of you actually take a second to look at what information is coming in before you hit forward? I'm sure not many of you would do that. So, the onus is also on us And Nanda, to your point about platforms trying to clean up, I don't agree to that fully because when we look at conversations and when we spend time on say a platform like Twitter, I mean the kind of conversations that one sees are kind of alarming at times because if you look at certain threads in a particular conversation, and I'd just like to mention the protest against Twitter that happened in Delhi on February 3rd. So it was kind of surprising because these were clearly right-wing groups that were trying to make a big noise against the platform because they feel that the platform is not reflecting right-wing views properly or is suppressing them. And on the other hand, we have a right-wing government in place, which is trying to sort of, rein in these platforms. So I think there is also that problem of that distinction.
Yeah. On cleaning up, I would just say if you go looking for it, it's all out there. It is no longer upfronted. So on Twitter, all the abuse that used to be there, it's still there. It is no longer in your timeline. You have to go looking for it. So that is how it's being cleaned up.
The solution, the easiest part that's within everybody's control is just at least read, if you're reading, consuming information, news on internet, always cross-check with the second source, at least second source. Like I say that read from two sources, it will cancel out, at least create a sense of doubt that this information probably there is a variation.
Okay.
Probably that may force you to go to the third news option to make up your mind. But as far as technological solutions, I'm not sure whether we have still been able to come to a close approximation of keeping it even, because the one system that Professor Jeremy mentioned was the trust factor. Many of the issues may not be false. There will be variation of states of difference of opinions. Obamacare, or here social or minimum income guarantee proposals here. So if you're talking about on the same issue, if you talk about graduates in an MBA school and the graduates at an economics institute, probably you'll find two different opinions. So if who is going to trust, they'll say that the one side will say it's bunkum, the other side may say it's what a great idea. So the trust, the one solution that builds on, most of the algorithms work on is ranking. So the entire crawling of the search Google model was how it ranked every site and on the basis of what's its utility. That kind of ranking in the information business, giving people power to rank a news item. I mean, you're not sure, you just have to put a box there and they'll start ranking it for you. So the technological solution or trust factors, I'm not sure. And if you put a human being trying to do that, there also, I don't know, that person may be a Democrat, may be a Republican in his personal opinion. So even that is not acceptable or it will be contested. So the technological solution, I'm not sure whether we have arrived at a very credible methodology.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Political discourse, I mean, that's a healthy thing. I mean, we should see things that we disagree with. We should have dialogue. I mean, those are very positive. I can completely agree. I think the fear is when there's just outright, lies or disinformation, things that are just completely fabricated or misappropriated in some way. Social media is so effective at reach and dissemination. You almost can't blame various campaigns for just utilizing it in its power. But yeah, I mean, discourse, it needs kind of to be moderated.
Okay, we're going to move on. We're running out of time. Raj.
Okay, thank you so much for this panel. I just want to ask you, is this new media and social media is a large distraction? I'm asking this question because of the fact that there is an assumption that people are being influenced, and we talked about polarization, by what is being presented in the social media, of which there is fake news and all of that. But while all of this is happening, even in 2014 elections, the fact remains that the winner went around the country 437 large rallies, something like 6,000 plus events, 300,000 plus kilometers of travel across 25 states. So significant reliance on face-to-face engagement with the voters. And we have had two governments of incumbency. So the question really that I want to ask you, or rather challenge you, is that is social media a good distraction and entertainment? And actually Indian voter is far more intelligent and sophisticated to really understand what's going on while consuming all kinds of entertainment that comes through, including real news and fake news and exaggerated news. But he or she is so informed, so intelligent, and will be able to differentiate from the real from the imaginary.
Can I answer that? I want to sort of divide it in two parts. And I think based on what we were just talking about in terms of solutions as well, we are ignoring the fact that a large percentage of this country is illiterate. So when we're looking at solutions, in terms of ranking or in terms of trying to create tools whereby we give them something where people can read. So to answer your question, I think when we look at social media per se, there is that rural and urban divide. So when you look at somebody like a Modi, the fact that he seldom gives interviews, we know that, he's not very kind to the media, but he has 46.5 million followers on Twitter, and people follow him on Twitter all the time. So who are these people? Is this just the people from urban India that we're talking about? But whatever information people consume from there, and his followers and the BJP, don't they relay that information across social media platforms and messaging apps? And somewhere there is an indirect consumption of information from a platform like Twitter. So how does one explain that?
I think it's such an amazing question because, as I said in my opening remarks, that it's never been definitively proven how much these disinformation campaigns actually had, what effect they've had on actually swaying the election. It is the acknowledgement that it was happening, I think, just really scared a lot of people. And to your point, it was sort of the losers that just were kind of looking for something to point to, and there has to be an acknowledgement of the allure that Trump had for a lot of Americans that were very fearful of the direction that the U.S. was going, and he had a very galvanizing effect on his constituency, the same way Modi has had, and so it's an interesting question.
Just to respond to Raj's question, I would not consider that it's a distraction for a voter. It's definitely an input, but it is not the dominant input to sway election outcome. So in fact, the empirical evidence of last 5 years will suggest when BJP was the most powerful in social media in Bihar, in Delhi, in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh. So empirical evidence doesn't suggest that it has a dominant role in dictating their electoral choices, but yes, it's not a distraction. It is going as an input. They are factoring it in as an additional information point. So you cannot call it a distraction, but definitely not in a controlling position. We are not sure how it will play out over the years.
If I can bring in a slightly different angle. So I cover technology, so I've interacted with a lot of companies. So a lot of the Chinese companies have the concept of online converting to offline. So I was once in a room with 300 people in it, and these 300 people are online influencers who have actually sold over 100 phones each. So if you understand the smartphone business, a dealer who can sell 100 phones is a top-rung dealer. These are single people who have actually been able to influence people to buy 100 phones each. So, and these are online influencers. So this conversion of a lot of online is also online to offline conversion also happens. So
selling phones is different from selling ideas.
No, so are you sure about that? We don't know that. No, we don't know that. We didn't know it in 2014. 2019 might be a bit more evolved than what it was in 2014. Because you might have pockets where these guys can influence, right? So how does that work? We don't know.
Even in the 2012 election, I was still getting emails forwarded to me by my friends and family saying that Obama was born in Kenya, or things like that. Just total fake stuff, or just total disinformation. And I have several questions. First, what I would do every time is I would go to Snopes.com to see what was true and what was not true, and then I would do an email blast to everybody else in that chain to say, this is not accurate. I'm wondering if there's a website like that. In addition, my children in school are taught about these things now. And I'm just wondering how much of that is happening in India. And I'm also wondering, it appears that there's still a lot of misinformation that might be spread through technology. And I'm wondering if there's I understand that a lot more people have access to radio, and I'm wondering if there's any efforts to try to correct some of this misinformation through radio.
So you have a few sites in India like Boom Live, and Boom Live has been sort of commissioned by Facebook and WhatsApp to check fake news that is spreading on their platforms. There are others too. There are a lot of and a lot of big news organizations are now investing in fact check. But the problem in India is slightly different from the US because you have one language to counter there, at the most two. Here you have at least 20. Right? So Boom Live can do it for Hindi and English. It can't do it for a Tamil, Telugu. It can't, and there are even smaller languages for which, how do you counter the narratives that are happening there? And they are completely different. As I said, it's a completely different conversation that's happening down south from what's happening here in Delhi. And often we have a very Delhi-centric view of things. And you travel down to Chennai and you know that nobody cares about what's happening in Delhi.
Let's get a question from the new generation.
Hello. I'm a sociologist, so I don't necessarily speak your language, but innovation is the heart of capitalism and social change. So are we trying to tell, let's go back to days of Doordarshan when there was only one source of information and it was all good information that we got? So isn't it naive to talk about regulation the way, or the way you guys are talking about on the podium? And I work with young people, and I see discerning young adults who are, for every information, they do go and find out more information. So isn't it naive to talk about regulation?
I don't think it.
I don't think any of us said about
I for one don't stand I don't support regulation of any kind. You cannot regulate the internet; it will only get worse.
So, between democratizing and polarizing effects of social media, I think democratizing effect is still, I think, in my view, has a larger weight than the polarizing effect. It does have pitfall, it is polarizing. The issue is that how we be alive and how the other institutions live up to that to deal with this challenge. We cannot just turn a blind eye that it has a very powerful democratizing effect.
Okay. In the front row.
I chat with my friends on social media, share homework, and I can learn about the world from it too. So how is it bad? Is it only bad? Because there are a lot of good things about it too.
In which ways is social media bad?
Yeah. Are any of you on social media, like WhatsApp and message, email?
If I understand you correctly, you are trying to ask us whether social media is bad, or are you gathering that from this discussion that we are saying social media is bad and you have a good time on social media
I
talking
just
to your
want to
friends?
ask if any of you are on social media.
I think all of us are on social media. I think we consume a lot of
Are you
information
saying
from
that it's
social media.
bad?
I think it's both bad and good. We brought up some really great examples of how social media really helps spread ideas and gives voice to the voiceless in many ways for people that want to share ideas without just, but it also spreads false information, fake things, and lies. And so it's both.
Yeah, I think social media can also be used for a lot of positive things, and what we are sort of trying to say here is that as consumers of social media, for people, I mean, when we consume or when we read anything, we should also be responsible that we should not share information that we are not sure of. So if you are doing something that is good, and if you're doing a project, for instance, for your school, and you want to share it with your friends, so that's a positive way of looking at it. But if you want to do something negative or something bad, there are people who are doing that as well. So I think it's up to you how you would like to use it.
We're running out of time, so maybe two more questions. The gentleman, can we, to the right, yeah. Oh, okay.
Hi.
And then,
it is so pleasant to hear about Ed Koch, the former mayor of New York. He was a dear friend, he won 3 terms, and you're right, absolutely right. I used to tell friends who were visiting New York that if you want to see the best show in town, go to a press conference of Ed Koch. He was that way. And he used to walk around, now we are talking about new media. He was probably the originator of this idea of reaching the people directly. He had a limousine, but he would still ride the subway and ask everybody the same question, how am I doing? So nice to meet you.
okay, good. Being his press secretary was an oxymoron.
Yeah, hi. Hi, we've talked a lot about spread of disinformation and lies through social media, which could be written by, I don't know, some political party's IT cell or some over-enthusiastic uncle who wants to just express information out there. But what I think we're forgetting is also there's a lot of disinformation and lies spread by organized mass media networks, which has eroded trust in mass media networks, and which is why when I see anything coming from, say, my uncle or a mass media network, I'm sort of putting it at the same level on the trust scale because either of them could be false. How do we now start building trust back in mass media networks? Where I think the problem lies in the fact that the business model seems to be broken. So how do we first fix that business model? Because mass media networks are funded by corporates and maybe even political parties with their own motives. One of the solutions that's offered quite popularly, and it's possibly worked in the West as well, is subscription-based news services where people pay for news. But in a country where majority of the people live on less than $2 a day, how does that become a mass model of serving news? So what is the solution? I'm just wondering.
I think everybody is trying to find a solution to it. I don't think. The one thing is that definitely the legacy media, because I think internet is a much bigger mass media than the legacy media now. So the legacy media has one thing, is the credibility, and that we have to observe certain things which we try to do while we try to compete with the new media on speed, but we hold us back. We have to keep accuracy first. So we cannot go wrong and then try to correct it. So there's some basic etiquette which we have to observe to retain our credibility. And I think that we cannot compromise. So that we are trying to keep it up in this medium. I don't know how long it will take for us to retain our brand in this crowded internet jungle. That is something we still are learning and trying to reskill ourselves. So many of the information now that's coming to us is coming from different mediums. We don't know where its epicenter is. So it's coming from WhatsApp, it's coming from Facebook, it's coming on Twitter, in hashtags in different forms. We are not skilled as a legacy media to figure out where the epicenter of this is. So couple of days back, there was a campaign, Shut the Fake Up. It would appear like a harmless campaign by enthusiast civilians, but it was a political party-driven campaign. So on the first day, probably the legacy media would not be able to identify that there is an epicenter which is politically aligned. So these things we have to reskill ourselves, try to figure out where to learn properly, where to create more hands in our legacy system who can identify these things and stop them from going in the legacy medium?
I think every business model has an inherent problem built in, and so I think the solution is that you have a diversity of business models. I mean, advertise-supported media will always be very sensationalized. Subscriptions will be very elitist. Publicly funded media will be influenced from threats of cutting that funding. I mean, there's always going to be some problem somewhere. Just wherever the money comes from, that's going to be the influence on the media. So I think the solution is just to have a variety of choices, and now we're seeing a lot of nonprofit funded media through donations, subscriptions.
Thank you so much. It's 7:45. It's time to end this. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. I want to thank the panel. You can thank them. And I also want to express my appreciation of such a polite and astute audience as well. You can applaud yourself there, too. Now let me turn over this to my colleague, Vice Dean Kish Batherjee.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming. We're hoping to have more of election-related discussions over the next several weeks as we in the run-up to the elections and into the elections. Getting journalists, on a Friday evening to spend their evening out here discussing. So thanks, Ravish and Nandu, for it. Thanks so much to the Indian Express Group, Raj, sitting out there, Raj Kamal Jha. Thanks so much, Raj, for supporting it. Thanks to my university, OP Jindal Global University, founding Vice Chancellor, Raj Kumar out there. Thanks so much for supporting it. Dean Tom Goldstein, the former press secretary, as he has mentioned several times. Thank you so much, Tom, for moderating. Jeremy, thanks so much for coming across all the way. And as Raj keeps saying, California and Sonipat are twin cities. We are slowly, getting there. San Francisco. And twin cities. So we are getting there. And thanks, Pankaj, for being here and sharing with us. Thanks, Ashima, for helping Tom there with the accent. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Please join us across the garden in the veranda for some tea, coffee, and snacks. Delectable snacks made by the IIC kitchen. Thank you.